On 23 July 1954, just after 6 in the evening on Fuad Street in downtown Alexandria, the air outside Cinema Rio held nothing unusual. Salt carried from the harbor, exhaust drifting from passing taxis, the slow drift of balcony dust settling on faded posters for American films. A caretaker on the roof garden watered a line of tired plants, letting the hose run while crowds below moved toward the cinema entrance to celebrate the second anniversary of the Free Officers' Revolution. Among them walked Philip Nethinson, an Egyptian Jew in a pressed jacket, a book under his arm, an incendiary device assembled according to instructions sent months earlier from Tel Aviv in a thin, typewritten cipher sheet. Egyptian police reports would later reduce him to a case number and a single line. The suspect's clothes ignited before he entered the building. In Israeli archives, the same night would be filed under a different name: The Unfortunate Affair. The bomb was small. The crack had opened inside two governments, and inside memory was not. By late 1951, downtown Cairo's cinemas and cafes around Emad el-Din and Bab al-Luk were already part of another map. Not for moviegoers, but for a small Israeli network later labeled Unit 131. The officer sent to build it, Avraham Dar, arrived under the British cover name John Darling, a Gibraltarian businessman with a plausible accent and a suitcase of papers. From rented rooms and borrowed back offices, he recruited young Egyptian Jews who had already helped smuggle people to Israel and now were asked to serve a different kind of mission. In those first meetings, held in crowded apartments above tram lines, names like Marcel Nino and Robert Dassa entered the files for the first time. Later, histories record Nino as a young athlete, drawn in by Dar's confidence and by the fact that someone from Israel finally sat across from her in person. Training sessions introduced invisible ink, simple codes, and basic surveillance routines. But memoirs of Israeli intelligence later described the cell as undertrained. Students asked to master techniques that felt as distant as nuclear physics. On those Cairo nights, the operation still had no scandalous name, only draft numbers in military intelligence folders in Tel Aviv. A chipped glass ashtray sat between Dar and his new recruits, cigarettes burned down untouched, as he explained that they would be eyes and hands for a state that few Egyptians around them had ever seen. At the bottom of one later dictionary entry, a single line summarizes their task: Sabotage operations in Egypt, 1954. Everything that followed starts here. The network was young, eager, and largely invisible. For now, their greatest protection was their ordinariness, the rhythms of work, prayer, and family that made them indistinguishable from any other residents of the Jewish quarter. In Tel Aviv, on a May afternoon in 1954, cigarette smoke hung low in the Defense Ministry corridors, while Colonel Binyamin Ghibli, head of military intelligence, carried a thin operational outline into Defense Minister Pinhas Lavan's office. According to later scholarship based on diplomatic and archival records, the plan that would be called Operation Susanna proposed using the existing Egyptian Jewish network to bomb Western and Egyptian civilian targets and blame them on local radicals. The aim was not casualties, but atmosphere. Insecurity severe enough that Britain might delay its withdrawal from the Suez Canal zone, and that American confidence in Egypt's new leadership would be shaken. Historians still disagree on what was said in that room. Inquiries decades later could not conclusively prove that Lavan authorized the operation, even as Ghibli insisted he had. What is documented is the assignment as summarized by one historian: to undermine Western confidence in Egypt by acts that produced arrests, demonstrations, and reprisals, while completely concealing the Israeli hand and directing suspicion toward the Muslim Brotherhood, communists, or unnamed malcontents. On the same date, Archival essays place Gamal Abdel Nasser in a rising arc, pushing Britain toward evacuation and presenting himself to Washington as a modern nationalist partner. In that climate, the small typed pages on Lavan's desk were an attempt to reverse a tide by staging chaos far from Tel Aviv's quiet meeting rooms. Somewhere in the ashtray between them, another cigarette burned down to its filter. The gesture would never appear in the protocols, but the decision would fracture Israeli politics for a decade. In the internal lexicon of the intelligence community, the plan was simply Susanna. Outside that circle, not even the Prime Minister yet knew such a word existed. By early 1954, Cairo's Bab al-Louq district and Alexandria's Fouad Street held lives that looked, on paper, unremarkable. In one file from a later intelligence history, Marcel Nino appears as the proprietor of a small travel agency, funded quietly from Israel and serving as a respectable front. She linked cells in Cairo and Alexandria, coordinating meetings between young men and women whose daytime occupations, students, clerks, technicians, would fill most of their Egyptian police records until the summer. Training for Operation Susanna introduced improvised bombs built with acid-filled containers suspended above nitroglycerin, timed so that the acid would eat through, release the detonator, and trigger an explosion hours after closing time. Accounts in later journalism describe devices hidden in books, briefcases, or sunglass cases, assembled from instructions sent through coded letters and brief visits by handlers. The aim was damage without blood, shattered glass, blackened doors, headlines that suggested instability, not massacres. In apartments rented near tram stops and cinema districts, the recruits practiced routes and coded phrases, then returned to routines that looked entirely civilian. Office ledgers balanced at night, laundry folded against the desert dust, neighbors heard on stairwells discussing film posters and football results. A cigarette often glowed on a balcony rail while someone pretended to watch the street for nothing in particular. Later, intelligence memoirs would describe the tradecraft as thin and the supervision flawed. But for those living under Egyptian law in 1954, the risk was not abstract. Each practice walk past a post office or library, each small adjustment of a bag strap, shifted an ordinary life a little closer to a military file in another language. In the margin of one declassified Israeli document, a handwritten note appears beside the unit's name. Emphasis on not being caught. Events in July would show how poorly that instruction survived the contact with reality. By the spring of 1954, cables traded between London, Washington, and Cairo reflected a narrow diplomatic corridor. The United States, under Eisenhower, had begun to support Egyptian demands for British withdrawal from the Suez Canal, hoping to court Arab nationalism against Soviet influence. Britain negotiated timetables and security guarantees. Israel watched from the side, fearing that a British exit would leave Nasser freer to arm and act against its borders. In this context, Operation Susanna was designed as leverage by other means. Egyptian Jews would place bombs in Western-linked sites, U.S. Information Service libraries, British-owned cinemas, central post offices, and the resulting panic, if properly attributed to Egyptian extremists, might persuade London and Washington that Nasser's Egypt was too unstable to trust. The bombs were meant to go off at night, when the buildings were empty, pushing headlines rather than funerals. From the perspective of Unit 131, described later as caught between Amman and Mossad over control, the mission also became a test of institutional prestige. Military intelligence would show it could operate deep in an Arab capital without relying on the Foreign Service. Some later articles would even mislabel the affair as Mossad's first operation in Egypt, folding it into a broader legend of Israeli espionage, despite the unit's formal chain of command. In Cairo and Alexandria, however, the stakes felt simpler. A knock on the door, a search, the weight of Egyptian state security. The planners in Tel Aviv saw maps and cables. The recruits saw street corners and police patrols. On the eve of the first bombing, the network's activities could still have faded into the anonymity of normal life. Within weeks, the word Susanna would become almost impossible to say aloud in official Israeli rooms. On 2 July 1954, the Central Post Office in Alexandria closed its doors as it always did. Clerks stacking incoming letters and setting aside foreign mailbags while the evening heat seeped in from the street. Somewhere among the shelves, a small package had been left in place according to instructions relayed from handlers through coded messages and face-to-face briefings. Late that night, a homemade device detonated, damaging part of the building but causing no injuries. Egyptian police reports recorded broken glass, scorch marks, and confusion about motive. Internal notes speculated about the Muslim Brotherhood or communists probing state authority. In Tel Aviv, the same incident reached Amman through radio and diplomatic channels as a success. Proof that timing mechanisms and cover stories worked. That Egyptian Jews could strike symbolic targets without leaving bodies behind. A cable reported the event in neutral language. Off the record, it was the first step in validating the unit's existence. For the operatives, the day had been more ordinary than the files suggest. One of them would have stood in line like any citizen, placing envelopes on the counter, nodding to a clerk who had seen him there before. Outside, a cigarette might have been lit more for the rhythm of the gesture than for the smoke. The only difference between routine and sabotage was a bag left on a shelf and the decision not to look back. The blast did not kill anyone, and newspapers treated it as a small, puzzling incident. Inside the network, it was read as confirmation. The operation could proceed. The quiet before the next bomb was filled with a dangerous confidence. 12 days remained before the next wave of attacks. On 14th of July 1954, staff at the U.S. Information Service Library in Alexandria began closing procedures just before 9 in the evening. Chairs pushed in, card catalogs checked, windows latched against the sea air. In Cairo, similar routines unfolded at the U.S. Library and at a British-owned theater. Members of Unit 131 had visited hours earlier, placing bags and books where they would be overlooked until the buildings were empty. Late that night, devices built from acid containers and explosives ignited, shattering glass, burning shelves, and blackening doors. The bombs caused property damage, but no casualties. American and British diplomatic cables expressed alarm at attacks on cultural centers and suggested that Egyptian authorities might be losing control of extremists. Egyptian internal security services tightened surveillance of known Islamist and leftist groups, even as they also increased quiet monitoring of the Jewish community. In Tel Aviv, preliminary reports confirmed that the false flag logic seemed to be working. Western targets hit, extremist groups blamed, Israeli involvement invisible. Within the cell, the feeling was not triumph so much as strained relief. Each successful detonation meant another crossing of a line that could not be uncrossed. Simple acts. Locking a shop, turning off a light, lighting a cigarette at a balcony window. Now carried the memory of devices left behind, ticking down in the dark. For those whose names would later appear in Cairo trial transcripts, the night of 14th July sits between anonymity and exposure. Officially, the mission was progressing. Offstage, Egyptian security officers began to look differently at ordinary bags and at the people who carried them. The next device would not be allowed to detonate unobserved. A fire engine had already been positioned near Cinema Rio. On the evening of 23rd July 1954, Alexandria celebrated the second anniversary of the Free Officers' coup. Fuad Street was busy. People moved toward Cinema Rio's entrance beneath foreign film posters and neon letters. Among them walked Philip Nathanson, an Egyptian Jew connected to the cell, carrying an incendiary device intended to ignite inside the cinema after closing, and add another anonymous act of extremist vandalism to the list. Egyptian intelligence, according to later reconstructions, had begun quietly tailing suspects after the earlier bombings. A fire engine stood nearby, conspicuous in its readiness. Somewhere between the street and his intended placement point, Nathanson's device malfunctioned. Egyptian accounts note that his clothing caught fire and that security personnel intervened immediately. The bomb that was meant to burn a building instead illuminated its carrier. In the days that followed, a search of Nathanson's apartment reportedly produced incriminating materials and names that led to the arrest of most of the network. In Tel Aviv, the incident reached military intelligence in fragments. Initial confusion, then confirmation that an agent had been arrested and others were being rounded up. The assignment's carefully constructed illusions of anonymous malcontents of perfectly timed devices collapsed into the blunt reality of interrogation cells. For Nathanson, there was little time to process what had gone wrong. The arc from street-level routine to state security custody took minutes. A dropped cigarette outside the cinema smoldered on the pavement, unnoticed by the gathering crowd. In operational terms, Rio was a small failure. One device, one arrest. In human terms, it was the hinge on which dozens of lives would swing from secrecy to exposure within a matter of days. The flame that caught Nathanson's jacket would burn through two governments for years to come. By early August 1954, Cairo's state security offices were filling with new files. Following Nathanson's arrest, Egyptian officers worked from seized documents and surveillance notes to track down other members of the network. Within weeks, 11 suspects, Egyptian Jews and undercover Israelis, were in custody. Their names included Moshe Marzouk, a surgeon from Cairo, Shmuel Azar, Marcel Nino, Robert Dassa, Victor Levy, and others whose biographies had, until then, rarely left neighborhood gossip or community records. Egyptian communiques publicized the arrests as the exposure of a Zionist spy ring, tying them to broader narratives about foreign plots against the state. In Israel, strict censorship kept the affair largely out of public view. Only within the intelligence community and among a small circle of political leaders was there clear knowledge that an entire unit had been compromised. Families of some operatives heard vague, delayed notices about detention and were cautioned to remain silent. Inside interrogation centers, the pace of events was different. Nights were measured not by clocks, but by questions, lights, blows, and pauses. Later accounts described the use of brutal methods by Egyptian security, designed to break resistance and produce coherent confessions. Each new name extracted under pressure widened the circle of those at risk. For the detainees, the routines of ordinary life, making coffee, opening shop shutters, lighting cigarettes, receded quickly behind the routines of survival. The operation had not been designed with an exit plan for failure. As the list of arrested operatives lengthened, so did the gap between the intent drafted in Tel Aviv and the reality unfolding in Cairo cells. The next entries in the file would not be about bomb placements, but about deaths in custody. Between late summer and December 1954, two names in the Cairo files acquired a final annotation: Yosef Carmen and Meir Max Beneth, both connected to Israeli intelligence, died by suicide in prison. Beneth, a Hungarian-born officer operating in Egypt on a separate mission, had been swept into the same machinery after his activities intersected with the unraveling of Operation Susanna. According to family testimony and later memorial writings, he took his own life on 21 December 1954, the day before he was due to stand trial, slashing his wrists and throat rather than face a public hanging. Carmen's death is recorded more sparsely in the sources. A brief note that he too killed himself under conditions of severe interrogation. Analyses point to the brutality of Egyptian methods, combining physical and psychological pressure as a determining factor. The suicides are mentioned in declassified Israeli documents and in later histories as examples of the extreme strain placed on captured agents. But the files are silent on their final hours. For the surviving detainees, news of the deaths moved through cell blocks as rumor and then as fact. In memoirs and interviews, some recall the sensation that a door had closed. If senior operatives could not endure, their own futures seemed narrowed to execution or long imprisonment. The small acts that once signaled control, straightening clothes, lighting a cigarette, pacing cell floors, became ways of passing time in a situation they could no longer influence. In Tel Aviv, updates filtered through diplomatic channels and Red Cross contacts. The mission's failure was no longer just operational. It had become a series of human absences. The chain of decisions that had begun with a plan on a minister's desk now included deaths that could not be publicly acknowledged. Each silence in the reports carried a weight that paperwork could not describe. On 11 December 1954, in a Cairo courtroom, the trial of the captured network began. Egyptian authorities presented the case as proof of Zionist sabotage and foreign-backed terrorism. The defendants, including Moshe Marzouk, Shmuel Azar, Marcela Nino, Robert Dassa, Victor Levy, and Philip Nathanson, stood before judges in a public gallery while evidence seized from apartments and workplaces was read out. Explosives, documents, code sheets. The proceedings lasted until 27th January 1955. International appeals were made on behalf of the accused. One British Jewish politician traveled to Egypt seeking clemency, and there were reports that President Nasser at one point hinted at leniency before aligning the sentences with those given to members of the Muslim Brotherhood. The final judgments condemned Marzouk and Azar to death by hanging, acquitted 2 defendants, and sentenced the remaining agents to terms ranging from 7 years hard labor to life imprisonment. On 31st January 1955, Marzouk and Azar were executed in Cairo. In later Israeli accounts and memorials, they are often referred to as martyrs of Cairo, their photographs framed in military exhibitions and community centers. The Egyptian press presented the hangings as a triumphant defense of national security. For those still in prison, the executions were a blunt demonstration of how the state could close a file. In a women's prison at Kanater and in men's blocks at Tura, long sentences began. In one later Intelligence Corps documentary, Ninio summarized the moment in a single sentence. It was as if our lives had ended, but we continued to have faith the ordeal would not last. The trial's transcripts fix the defendants as names and numbers. Such fragments restore a sense of interior time. On paper, the operation was over. Politically, it was only just beginning. In Jerusalem in early 1955, the affair surfaced in cabinet discussions and closed committees under euphemisms. The unfortunate affair, the bad business. Prime Minister Moshe Sharet had not known of Operation Susanna in advance, and now faced the dual problem of imprisoned agents abroad and a power struggle at home over who had authorized the operation. Defense Minister Pinhas Lavon denied giving the order. Military Intelligence Chief Binyamin Ghibli insisted he had. An inquiry board led by Supreme Court Justice Isaac Olshan and former IDF Chief of Staff Yakov Dori examined documents and testimonies, but could not conclusively determine responsibility. Lavon tried to shift blame toward his subordinates, including Shimon Peres, then Director General of the Defense Ministry, and toward Ghibli for alleged insubordination. Sharet, seeking to preserve some semblance of cohesion, sided with Peres and accepted Lavon's resignation in February 1955. David Ben-Gurion returned from Sde Boker to replace him as defense minister, drawing the scandal deeper into the core of Israeli politics. Records of a tense 28 December 1954 meeting between Lavon and Ghibli reveal the emotional undercurrent. "I wanted to give you another chance to tell me the whole truth," Lavon told his intelligence chief. "Don't hide anything, neither person nor issue." Ghibli responded, "I can't believe you, Mr. Minister. I'm very sorry." The brief exchange, preserved in transcripts, encapsulates years of mutual suspicion and contested memory. In the middle of these arguments sat the fact that 4 operatives were dead and others remained in Egyptian prisons, each ashtray in the committee rooms, each cigarette lit, crushed, and forgotten, marked another hour in which institutional reputation took precedence over acknowledging the human cost of a failed operation. By the end of 1955, the Lavon affair had already begun to fracture parties and alliances. The original bombs had damaged buildings. The scandal damaged trust within the state that had ordered them. While Israeli leaders argued over documents in Jerusalem, the surviving members of Unit 131 lived out long sentences behind Egyptian walls. Marcel Nino and Robert Dassa served 15 years. Meir Meyuhas and Meir Zafran 7. Victor Levy and Philip Nathanson received life. Nino was held in the women's prison at Kanader, where, according to accounts, she attempted suicide and spent time in hospital under harsh conditions before returning to her cell. In interviews decades later, Nino recalled the way her sense of time compressed around small routines. Folded clothes, counted steps, a cigarette shared on rare occasions with other inmates. "It was as if our lives had ended," she said of the verdicts. "But we continued to have faith the ordeal would not last." Dassa, Levy, and others described similar oscillations between despair and a stubborn attachment to the idea that Israel would eventually secure their release. Outside the prisons, the affair influenced regional events in indirect ways. Analysts of Israeli-Egyptian relations link the fallout from Operation Susanna to escalating hostility, Israeli reprisal raids in Gaza, Nasser's search for Soviet arms, and ultimately the Suez Crisis of 1956. Some scholars go further, tracing a line from the scandal to Israel's deepened cooperation with France on nuclear matters, arguing that the crisis contributed to a strategic logic that favored self-reliance and covert technological advances. In 1960 and again in 1964, new inquiries into the Lavon affair revisited old testimonies and documents, uncovering perjury and suggesting that the original operation might indeed have been undertaken without Lavon's explicit authorization. Ben-Gurion's refusal to accept these findings led to his own resignation and to splits within the ruling Mapai party. In this sense, the echoes of bombs in Cairo and Alexandria continued to reverberate in Israeli domestic politics long after the physical damage had been repaired. For the prisoners, the major milestones came in quieter forms. A rumor about a future exchange, a change in guards, a letter received after months of silence. When the last of them were finally released in 1968, Following the Six-Day War and subsequent negotiations, they stepped into a country that had changed politically and militarily, yet still held unresolved arguments about who had sent them and why. In 2005, more than 50 years after the bombs in Cairo and Alexandria, surviving members of the network and families of the dead gathered at an IDF ceremony where ranks and decorations were formally awarded for their service in Operation Susanna. After long debates within the defense establishment, the state now recognized them as soldiers who had acted under orders, even if those orders remained politically contaminated. Photographs from the event show aging men and women standing in uniform alongside generals who had been children when the operation failed. For some participants, the gesture offered belated closure. For others, it underscored how long institutional hesitation had left them suspended between hero and embarrassment. Journalistic retrospectives published around the 50th anniversary revisited the affair in tones that mixed criticism and reluctant admiration. Criticizing the amateurish tradecraft and political deception, acknowledging the courage and suffering of the agents, and noting how the story had become a cautionary tale in intelligence circles about the risks of false flag operations and interagency rivalry. In one of these documentaries, a camera lingers on Nino as she lights a cigarette, the smoke curling upward in a quiet room far from the cells of Canada. The same simple gesture recurs in archival footage of cabinet meetings and inquiry commissions. Ministers, intelligence chiefs, and committee members smoking while arguing over responsibility. The cigarettes mark time passing more than decisions made. They are the smallest visible trace of an operation in which almost everything else was buried in closed files and encrypted cables. The story that began with a small flame in a pocket on Fuad Street ends, for the viewer, with another slow-burning ember in a safe room in Israel, decades later. Outside, cinemas still operate in Alexandria. New governments come and go in Cairo and Jerusalem. On the page, the Lavon affair is a sequence of dates, names, and outcomes. In the lingering image, it is a thin line of smoke rising in silence, carrying with it the unresolved question of who ultimately paid for a plan that was never supposed to leave a trace.